Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I trust that there's no need for me to speak in dramatic terms to you about the injustice perpetrated against Dr. James Coates. Dr. Coates is a pastor in Alberta, Canada, in case you have not heard, who is, as I speak, in jail. He's in jail because he was charged with failure to submit to public health restrictions that were administered in Alberta, Canada. He was offered the opportunity to be free on bail pending charges and trial, but one of the conditions of his bail was that he had to agree not to preach. I don't think anybody would dispute that, nor these other facts, that whatever is the standing government in Alberta created a requirement that churches not go above 15% of capacity. And Dr. Coates determined, along with his congregation, that they would not comply with that request. So how do we think about this? Well, I want you to listen to what a police inspector from Canada involved in this had to say. He said, to be very clear, I'm quoting Inspector Mike Locken, to be very clear, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's objective is not to interrupt church services, prohibit services, nor deny people's right to practice their religion, merely to ensure that public health restrictions are adhered to while doing so. Doesn't that just sound so reasonable? Except, of course, that it's not. What is so easy to overlook, though it should not be, that following the public health restrictions that have come down would require that people not have church services, that they not have the right to practice their religion. These two things are at odds. What happens here is that the government presumes to define what is part and parcel of a church's calling with respect to worship. Now, as far as I know, nobody here in the United States has been put in jail, but we have had similar kinds of restrictions imposed with legal penalties with respect to percentages that could be there, about whether or not masks had to be worn, and about whether or not songs could be sung. Do you understand what's happening here? There are those, again, out there who are saying that Dr. Coates is in rebellion. He's failing to submit to the governing authorities. That the government's not stopping anybody from worshiping, because they can all do this by Zoom. They can do this on their own. They can do this 15% of the congregation at a time. They don't get to decide. They don't get to decide what percentage of the assembly assembles when they're called to assembly by the Lord Jesus Christ, who rules over all things. They don't get to decide what is said, although, by the way, that too is just around the corner in Canada and coming down the pike to us as well. Where in Canada you can already, in some ways, get in trouble for teaching the plain teaching of Scripture on sexual matters. I'm not arguing that we have come to the place such as was experienced in the Roman Empire when Nero would take Christians and dip them in tar and tie them to a stake and light them on fire to light up his garden parties. I'm not arguing that. I trust Dr. Coates is safe and secure, even while he's in jail. But I want you to understand that these are benchmark moments. To arrest a man and say, you may not leave this jail unless you promise not to preach. That's serious. That's significant. A civil government saying to Christians, you may not gather beyond 15% of your membership. I want you to understand something. I want you to understand that when false accusations are made, almost every time those accusations are going to have some element of truth to them. Here's what I mean. When the Pharisees looked at Jesus, do you really believe that they thought to themselves, well, that guy is a glutton. That guy is a wine-bibber? Not in the least. I'm going to suggest that it's exceedingly likely that Jesus ate no more than your average Pharisee and drank no more than your average Pharisee. He did, however, eat and drink more than John the Baptist. So they come and bring this accusation. The reason they bring the accusation is because they hate him. The reason they hate him is because he shows their guilt by his own innocence. But they don't charge Jesus with being too righteous, with being too holy. They charge him with being a glutton and a wine-bibber. In a similar manner, when these charges are brought against Dr. Coates, the point is not, we're really mad at him for preaching, or even we're really mad at him for what he said in his sermon. If you want to understand why Pastor Coates is in jail, I'll tell you why. He's in jail for the very same reason that Nero's Christians were burned at the stake. In both instances, the real offense was a failure to acknowledge the state as God. I've said it before. If you know anything about the Roman Empire, you know that it was part and parcel of their strategy. It helps explain the relationship between the Roman authorities and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Their strategy was that at whatever people they conquered, they let you alone. Be what you want to be. Continue with your traditions. Continue with your culture. Continue with your worship. You don't have to change any of that. All you have to do is acknowledge the authority of Rome over all things. Do you understand that those tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Christians who were put to death as martyrs by the Roman Empire were killed not for what was perceived to be errant theology, but they were killed for their politics. You see, in the Roman Empire, they had a ceremony by which one would communicate their loyalty to and submission to Rome and its emperor. You would burn a pinch of incense. You would bend the knee, and you would proclaim this pledge of allegiance, this confession of faith. You would say, Caesar ho Kyrios. Caesar ho Kyrios, which is Greek, meaning Caesar is Lord. Now again, Caesar didn't care if, as long as you affirmed that Caesar is Lord, that the rest of your days you were a pious Jew. He didn't care if you were a pious Christian the rest of your days. He didn't care if you were a Buddhist or a Muslim, though those didn't exist yet. He didn't care any of those things. As long as you are willing to bend the knee, burn the incense, and confess that Caesar is Lord. The difficulty was here. The very first confession of faith of the Christian church, even before the Apostles' Creed, the very first creed that was universally confessed by Christians at the birth of the New Testament church was only 3 words. Christos ho Kyrios. Christ is Lord. They would not say Caesar is Lord. They would not acknowledge him as the supreme authority. And that is precisely what Dr. Coates wisely, humbly, faithfully, biblically, courageously refuses to do. Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, called Dr. Coates to preach. They called him to preach to the sheep put under his care. Not the 99 and leaving 1, not the 1 and leaving 99, and certainly not the 15 and leaving out 85. But to preach to the sheep under his care. Friends, don't go looking for reasons and ways to surrender. Ask God for the strength to be faithful, to be like Daniel, who all he had to do was change his habit. And instead of praying 3 times a day towards Jerusalem with his window open, all he had to do was close the window. But he wouldn't. And he ended up in the lion's den. Pray for courage. Pray for Dr. Coates. I have for many, many years been promoting a certain principle of biblical hermeneutics that says whenever you see someone in the Bible doing something really, really dumb, do not say to yourself, how can they be so dumb? Instead, say to yourself, how am I dumb just like them? Well, there's a corollary to the principle that goes like this. If you want to know who you are in the story, you're the sinner. I raise this because we come today in our ongoing Bible in 5 minutes segment to that book of the Bible which gives what may be the most disturbing but nevertheless accurate picture of what we are. I speak, of course, of the book of Hosea. You know the story of the book of Hosea, that Hosea is God's prophet, and God calls him to go and take Gomer as a wife. Gomer is a sexually immoral woman, and yet Hosea is called to go and rescue her. And one might think that that would be the end of the story. It's a great sign of God's grace and kindness and our rescue. But that's just the beginning of the story. Because the truth is that Gomer goes back out and returns to her life of sexual immorality. And God, in turn, calls Hosea to go get her back. Now, I raise the question of who we are in the story because so often when this story is referenced or preached, what we're given is instruction on how to be more like Hosea. We're given Hosea as a moral example of what we should be. And there's certainly truth in that. But if you want to know not what we should be, but what we are, we're Gomer. And when I say we, friends, I don't mean humanity. Gomer doesn't match humanity. Gomer matches humanity at the beginning of the story, when she is a woman of sexual immorality, but she gets rescued. She gets redeemed. She gets purchased just like us, believers. And as a believer, she goes back to that lifestyle. This is not just a picture of how bad sinners humans are. It's a picture of how bad sinners God's people are. And in fact, it is intentionally so. The whole drama is established to teach God's people, this is who you are. You are Gomer. I am Hosea. But before you turn away in horror from this true, accurate, but profoundly discouraging picture of what we are as Christians, do not lose sight of the fact that Hosea goes back and rescues her again, which is precisely what our Father does. It reminds me a bit of Jesus and his parable of the shepherd and the 99 and the 1. We think it's a wonderful story about how God will go and rescue the lost. But it's not 99 or 100 goats. It's 100 lambs. It's one of the lambs that have already been purchased, that are already a part of the flock, that wanders off. We need, as God's people, to learn to acknowledge the depth and the scope of our ongoing struggle with sin, so that we might grow in our gratitude and appreciation for and joy in and dependence on the ongoing grace of God. Being sinners rescued by God is not just a story from our past. It's a story every day. Do you know why his mercies begin afresh each day? Because we need them each day. The book of Hosea is not the story of a woman of ill repute who gets rescued and dressed up and cleaned up and they live happily ever after. No, it's a story of someone who's been rescued, who keeps returning to what she needed to be rescued from. Friends, I encourage you to take a deep dive into the book of Hosea. If you haven't, go back, look at it, and see yourself in the mirror. You are, and I am, Gomer. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.